in Norwegian, a language I cannot master, so I feel a little bit frustrated. So I'll ask you to repeat again the question in English as soon as we start. Yeah, perfect. First of all, somebody left a very, very nice pen. If you want to claim it back. No, okay. Such a pity. And so goes my funding of research. Okay. I will propose to start with if each of you has some question for the other speakers first round, and then open the floor with the people. Maria.
Thank you. I can start with one question to Vigdis. You mentioned the possibility to take a larger use of the temporary protection scheme. How will that work in practice? How do you see that work in practice, also politically speaking in Europe? And what would temporary be, and what would happen at the end of a temporary period?
That's a very good question, and quite a tricky one, isn't it? Because what we have seen is that European states, heads of states or governments, have not been interested in making use of the directive on temporary protection. And as I mentioned, it takes for the council to decide that they're up against a mass influx situation, and then to implement the directive, and this has never taken place. And the history of it was that after the Bosnian crisis and then the Kosovo crisis in the 90s, the European states realized that they needed such an instrument, but when they have it in place, they do not wish to use it. I think it has to do largely with the fact that they are afraid those who are given temporary protection and allowed to stay for a number of years will never leave. Because the tradition in Europe is to provide a permanent type of asylum. So there isn't really much of a culture for using the temporary scheme. So reality is that we don't see any attempts to make use of it. It has been proposed. The answer has been no so far. It's not on the agenda for the discussion at the moment. But I think the good thing about it is that it could save more people more quickly. And then we would have to know how to end the temporary scheme. For instance, temporary does not mean that individual examinations of the asylum cases will not take place. It's just a postponement. So that's guarantee number one in regard to refugee law, if you like. And also, if it's protracted, obviously, governments need to know what the limit should be. Should it be after 3 years? It should not be temporary anymore. Should it be 5 years? These are discussions.
Yeah. There is perhaps one example. It's not a temporary protection directive, but Germany, due to the Syria crisis, has put in place this humanitarian admission program in coordination with UNHCR and in coordination with IOM. We're actually helping for the pre-departure assistance and then the transportation part of it. And what they have looked at, or in their humanitarian admission program, which is now up to 20,000 places, and then the Länder, so the regions as it were, have added another 10,000 places for private sponsorship, so via family, families that would privately sponsor and would say, we will bring more than the core family over to Germany and we will help them. And there the temporariness is, we will evaluate depending on how the Syria crisis evolves. And so we are now 4 years, 5 years down the line, and so they're still there. And obviously Germany is also not saying they will have to go back now, because nobody can envisage going back to Syria at this stage. But so that might well come, say, in 5 or 6 years' time. By that time, of course, they might already be doing so well or be so well integrated that might also have already changed the dynamics. And in our conversations with the German government when we were developing this humanitarian admission program, they seem to be realizing this as well. They were saying, we are aware that most of them might actually not return. But on the other hand, we don't wish them to leave them in limbo, and we would like to, as the German government, to provide opportunities for a few among them, because they realize that it's just a drop in the ocean, to actually develop their skills and to work in Germany and to see other systems, so that if they wish to return or if they want to do something for Syria, that could also promote the rebuilding of Syria. That was the idea.
Thank you. Vigdis, I think you want to...
Yeah, I just want to compliment Germany and also Sweden. I think those are the two special countries in Europe at the moment.
Yes.
So what I'm really aiming for, or would like to see happen, is for the European Union countries and also the other Schengen countries cooperating with the European Union countries, taking a similar initiative.
We as well.
Paul, Lina?
I think.
Okay. Well, my first question is, how do we fix Libya? If you have a quick answer, I would like to know. But apart from that, it'd be very interesting, I think, to hear some thoughts on what are some mechanisms that can be put in place for the migration path. We've talked a lot about the refugees and the screening systems we're familiar with. Mm-hmm. But what could actually be some migration options? And how could they work given the present situation in the Mediterranean? Mm-hmm. You don't need to have the whole picture, because I know it's hard, but just some of the elements or mechanisms that could be in place.
Yeah, well, we have been advocating also for humanitarian visas. So next to resettlement and humanitarian admission, humanitarian visas, which could be a quick way to enable people to come into Europe in a legal and safe manner. So that's actually the main idea. We have to open up more legal and safe avenues to come to Europe. Family reunification is another part of those measures that could be taken. We have a family reunification guidelines, directives. The EU member states can act on it. It is all very restrictive. They have all restricted their family reunification policies over the last couple of years instead of broaden them up because of the fact that there are so many people in need. And then I think that what I was also trying to say earlier on, we need to, in Europe, have another rethinking of our labor migration policies, and that goes much further. We have to think about where do we want to go as a Europe in terms of prosperity, and how do we want to factor in migration and labor migration. It will not come all from within Europe. I'm not the labor migration specialist of the office, which my colleague is, and then she can talk very well on this topic. But it's taking into account that our population is declining, or demographically getting older. We are in need of a number of workforce, which we will not get out of the European countries. Obviously, if we talk about labor migration policies, we will need to take into account a set of measures. It cannot just be labor migration by itself and all the poor migrants just come over to Europe, because that won't work with the workforce that we need. So it's really building an ingenious system whereby we talk with private companies what kind of labor force they need, but then also in the public sector, what workforce do we need, and how can we kind of make that compatible with what are there as migrants coming to Europe. And then I'm excluding the whole refugees or those in need of protection, because they fit another pathway. And that would help us with building a real a Europe that could grow and that could prosper. And what we then need to start is discussions with employers on how can we have in place programs where there is thinking on pre-departure sort of preparation for those people to come. What about languages? Can we allow some people to speak English because they know English, or will we all require them to learn Norwegian, Swedish. We know that those are obstacles. We need to start thinking about that, because that is, of course, some advantage that Australia and Canada have had, that they have worked on their labor market and their labor migration policies much more, and they have thought about that already a few years back. I think Europe should start on that.
I don't know if you want to intervene,
Yeah.
but I have a lot of questions for you, actually. Myself.
Should I come? I'm not going to comment on any of this migration aspects because that's not my expertise. I thought what both of you touched upon, the fact that ships have actually almost more of an obligation through the SAR and the SOLAS conventions. And I think what you mentioned was that moving the EU further out instead of is not really increasing the SAR capacity. Now, what we're hearing from the EU is that they're talking about increasing the Triton operational area and putting in a search and rescue element into it. Is that what you mean by that you're moving the EU border further out by increasing this space? If that's not the option, what would be the alternative right now in a realistic way? Thank you.
What I meant by that, well, first and foremost, Triton, as opposed to Mare Nostrum, Mare Nostrum went far beyond the Italian borders, whereas the Triton is for the moment staying much closer to the Italian shores. So this is not a case of moving it further out, but I think that is also in recognition of the fact that what was done earlier in terms of seeking to patrol beyond EU borders to stop migrants before they reach the European border. Now they realize that, well, as I said, that there's almost no use in doing that because they can't push them back. But that's also why it's a bit puzzling to hear all the insistence on we are reinforcing the border control through Frontex, because what can actually be done at this sea border? That's why I'm arguing that this border should rather find itself on land, where competent authorities can process the demands, who are entitled to protection, who is not, and what would be then their return options. Then so it's I think that de facto border should rather find itself on the land border of Europe. When I say that now we may see a shift towards moving it further out is with the recent decision to launch this military operation to sink the smugglers' boats, because that by demonizing, criminalizing the smugglers as the main sort of target to solve the current situation, that becomes a way of saying legitimating to move beyond the European borders now, to take action to eliminate the tools they're using to transport migrants.
Yeah, I have a question to touch on something which I think has not been discussed today at all, which could be a consequence of, pushing back, in inverted commas, migrants when the smugglers' boats are targeted. Where will they end up? Where will the migrants end up? Where will the refugees end up? Will they be pushed back? Not pushed back in the sense that you're describing, but pushed back nevertheless. They will not be able to reach the European shore. So what I was thinking, one element which we have not been discussing is the ideas that have been forwarded from time to time on establishing camps in North Africa, in regard to not allowing people to cross the ocean. Now I'm a little bit back on the refugee track, but nevertheless, have you heard, any of you from your environment, for instance, in Brussels now, discussions on how they want to actually solve the problem of people on those boats? What will happen to the migrants and the refugees when the smugglers are targeted?
I don't know what will happen particularly to them when they're targeting the smugglers, or when they're targeting the boats that they're on, because that's something that we haven't heard the solution to in Brussels. I'm not sure whether they have thought that far. But if we talk about the idea of camps or offshore processing, sort of transit centers in Libya, Niger, those were the countries that were named. Well, how would that work? Because if we are offshoring our asylum processing, first of all, these states, with Libya being a failed state and not sure who we have to deal with there to get that agreement, that seems doubtful. Then let's go to Niger again, because we're already getting so much development and humanitarian aid and response centers, and putting that all on Niger. I'm not sure how they will be able to cope in the end. But if we then get an agreement or the green light from Niger to do that, where is the legislative base for that? Because we're not in Europe, and so how will the asylum processing work? Or will it then, and because there needs to be a sort of determination, refugee status determination, then if UNHCR is asked to do that, the refugee status determination, what if, for example, that center sits in Niger and a lot of West African migrants are ending up in that center being processed and not being seen fit for refugee status? What do you do with those? You ask them nicely to voluntarily return, and some will say, well, we won't, because we don't want to go back to our situation where we were and where we didn't have any prospects for education or opportunity to have a job. So we don't want to go back. So you leave them in Niger. I mean, these countries are not, they're not blind. They know as well what will happen, and then they will sit with a number of people but they don't know what to do with, and that the EU doesn't know what to do with neither.
It seems there is a question from the floor. Kristin?
That was just a comment here. What will happen? What will happen to the people? I mean, if you start thinking about boat destruction, those boats are going to be the ones on your slides. They're going to be empty for about 4 minutes. And then the smugglers will make sure that there are refugees or migrants or preferably children on board. That means that the boats cannot be destroyed. The worst thing that could happen is that if governments manage to extend the war on terror to destruction of boats, because then you're suddenly looking at the possibility of applying an IHL framework, which allows for proportional targeting. If you can't target civilians, but if civilians die, to destroy legal combatants or military objectives, that's okay, right? So the worst thing that could happen is that if you get this ISIS, Al-Qaeda on board rhetoric going, and I think humanitarian NGOs and human rights NGOs should just write some worst case scenarios op-eds immediately and put them out there and say, this is the worst, most horrible, outrageous thing that could happen. We're sure that obviously you're not going to say this. Because I think we really need to be very vigilant now about where this is going in terms of this boat destruction.
Absolutely, and we have to also be clear on this. The smugglers and the facilitators, they will change their modus operandi. They are much more imaginative than we are, and actually there were reports and there was in the newspapers, and of course, how far is this true or not true, but The Guardian and BBC were saying that they had spoken with some of these facilitators. They were even in video reports saying, we were already surprised that the EU has for so long let these boats drift back to our coast, back into our hands, where we just could load them again and then send them out to sea again. And then you were talking about unseaworthy vessels. But it was kind of your own fault. You left them there at sea, so they were battered around a bit, then came back to the Libyan coast and reloaded them again. So I think it's a complete false idea that if we go and destroy these vessels, that it's something that I'm not saying this by just myself, but it's a message that IOM has been giving by the regional director and others as well. Yeah.
Just a slight comment to that. The Italian Rescue Coordination Center, whenever a merchant vessel is asked to pick up refugees, they tell them to destroy the boats. That's generally the standing rule. So, but as we saw from the pictures, they come and pick them up forcibly with guns. And so as long as you leave sort of merchant vessels, which are unarmed, to pick up these refugees, you won't be able to destroy these vessels whereas when it's actually the Italians that come and do it, they destroy them. They have a system to do it.
You're supposed to put them on fire, or?
Anyway, they just say destroy them. So the crew has to be imaginative. Either if you can put some of these wooden boats on fire, but as one of the rescue operation we had last week is a rubber boat, a tiny rubber boat. So then you just either take it on board the ship or you just puncture it and it sinks. That's the problem here. The crew has been sort of forced to figure this out on their own. So.
Which is very interesting because you destroy also evidence in that way.
Yeah, that was another thing that they were saying.
But
Yes.
I know that there is a question from the bottom of the floor, but before, I have another question for you, Lynn, connected to that comment. You mentioned at the end that the crew feel unsafe because of there is a shared danger for migrants, also for crews that are not ready to operate that kind of continuous search and rescue operations. But doesn't it scares you, the idea of bringing special operation forces and war? In the map you showed, you are very close to the coast and so on. So I can imagine that war will get very close also to your boats. So are you sure that this is the best way forward, because you are exchanging the danger of few Kalashnikov against a full-fledged military operation?
Yeah, I will be sort of, right now we still don't know the details around this military operations. We don't really know how it's going to work. The fact that they're going to destroy boats, how do you destroy sort of a rubber boat? We don't really understand the complete sort of picture behind this. Yes, in general, the situation in Libya, we still make port calls in Libya. The security situation in Libya has been bad for quite some time. And as I also showed from my first sort of map, we are in areas where there is war. There are still ships that make port calls to Yemen. So we are quite used to tackling risks and security problems. But yes, I don't making the security situation, I think a military intervention can make the general security situation in Libya even worse, which can have a spillover on the maritime sector, which we've already seen with a tanker that was bombed off Libya. That was by sort of the Libyan forces a couple of weeks back. So it is a concern, but I don't want to say anything until I know the complete sort of plan, the military action plan. If it's more sort of doing just groundwork in Libya, or if it's actually targeting and doing airstrikes, because that is quite worrisome.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right, thanks. I have a couple of questions following up on the military option.
May I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Asbjørn Løvbekk is the name. The EU decision to use the military option, is there a decision or is there a plan waiting for some sort of international consensus on the issue? In other words, the EU representative was in New York at the Security Council some time back and asked for a Security Council resolution or a mandate to implement some of the military options. Now, what happens if that consensus is not forthcoming? Will the European Union then do it on their own? Because the obvious possible answer is that the Security Council will not decide to support it because Russia and China might still be upset with certain decisions back in 2011 in terms of bombing Libya and not agree to it. Would the European Union then go on its own? And I also think it's important to explore the whole range of options on the military side, from the hard to the soft, if you like. And the softest version would, of course, be a limited armed presence on civilian ships that takes part in the search and rescue operations, which seems to be the Norwegian option, sending one ship but having a few armed policemen aboard. And then you have the pushback operations using naval power to turn around the refugee ships and put them back on the shore of outside Tripoli. And then you have the sort of sinking the ships, landing people on the shores in Libya, etc., etc. So there's a number of different aspects to a military operation. I wonder which aspects are now being actively considered in terms of the EU operations. And is it legitimate to intervene militarily in a country like Libya, which is a failed state? Would that come in under the heading of humanitarian intervention, if you like? Limited but direct military intervention on the shore, rather than only in the Mediterranean waters. Just another, just a couple of questions for clarification. The safe harbor argument. Who defines what a safe harbor is? And is with reference to the Mediterranean, is the operational definition that any and all harbors in EU countries are considered safe, and no harbors in the Mediterranean outside the EU would be defined as a safe harbor? Is that the operational aspect of that? And final one, I think Vigdis might want to address that. The Dublin Convention, it's not being fully implemented, to put it mildly, at the moment. Would it be better if the contracting parties had actually now said, look, temporarily we suspend the Dublin Convention, rather than accepting a situation where it's not clearly being consistently implemented? Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a lot of questions. Do we want to add up another question from the floor, or you prefer to? No, let's. Yeah, let's have one more.
Thank you very much. Chris Ward. Just first wanted to say I thought all the presentations were really clear, interesting, and inspiring, which is not something one can always say at meetings like this. My first point was that I grew up in England, and as an adolescent, I remember clearly seeing pictures of Vietnamese people being forced onto return vessels or planes being taken back to Vietnam forcibly. So perhaps it wasn't wholly a positive story, that the example you gave, although I did appreciate it and I really liked your presentation. I was going to ask you the same question that you asked Joe, which was, because you focused on the fact that, look, come on, there are not so many people. We can absorb them in Europe. We've got the capacity. We've got the compassion. Let's do it. But what is the question is, we've got a rising number of economic or opportunist migrants who want to move to Europe as a choice of country area of preference. What are the options for that? And as we heard from talks this morning, far larger numbers are wanting to come. 40% of Nigerians polled want to come to Europe. That's a frightening number. So my point is, sorry, I'll come to the point, which is this idea that you said, Joe, of increased legal avenues will only work and be viable if the deterrence for illegal avenues is seriously taken. I'm allowed to go to Canada, Australia, I think in New York, America, if I follow stringent rules for immigration. The only reason why, if I did want to move there, I would follow those rules is that I know that the penalties for not following those rules are pretty serious. So you can't have two-track system where one's not taken seriously. Everyone will revert to smuggling again, if they can't get onto the legal scheme. Thank you. That was a question.
And I will resist and refrain from comment, but open again to my speakers. Please.
There was one question which I just looked up because I put note of it regarding the decision by the council to combat the smugglers. And I put down the wording from the council decision where it says it approved that it would conduct a military crisis management operation to disrupt the business of middle of human smuggling and trafficking networks in the southern central Mediterranean. And this was adopted on the 18th of May. So what does this imply in regard to the conversation which was taking place in New York, I don't know, but I know that the council actually made this adoption of this decision. But the other question was more on what I know, and I know what I mean. This concerns the Dublin regulation. Convention is gone. There's no convention anymore. But the Dublin III regulation, which is in force at the moment. The Dublin system, when member states were adopting the Dublin III, they actually also discussed whether to make a freeze mechanism, which was proposed by the Commission, so that in cases when it was unfruitful or difficult to return people back to a country because of, for different reasons, that they would apply a freeze mechanism. This did not fly in the Council. So what the regulation is left with are possibilities of making exemptions. No Dublin state is obliged to return an asylum applicant to another member state for examination. But at the same time, all the member states are aware that if they all stop sending back, then more or less the Dublin system would be void of meaning. So it's what would be the best thing would be for member states to actually come together and decide that for the moment we will not return, we will not make use of the mechanism, make a political decision on that. We will not make use of it, towards the southern states where the pressure is larger, until we get our act together and have decided how we want to do our burden sharing and our solidarity policy, which is actually a legal term. In the Lisbon Treaty, it says that these rules should be applied in accordance with solidarity among European states. This is what Article 80 says, but European states seem to have forgotten about it. It's difficult to define what solidarity is.
Yes, on the questions on Vietnam, a couple of examples. We ourselves, the Norwegian Refugee Council, run a program for the return to Vietnam of unaccompanied minors from camps in Southeast Asia, where they've been through a regular status determination process, and where it was additionally determined to be in the best interest of the child to be reunited with his or her family in Vietnam. And they were all sent back against their will. But it worked quite well, and they were followed up, and it's been evaluated. But there was a lot of noise and a lot of protests that we were going to send people back against their will at all. But I think if you want to, and the same, when you saw pictures, yes, at the end of the CPA, there was still some Vietnamese asylum seekers in Southeast Asia who had been there for years, after the whole process had terminated, who refused to go voluntarily back home, but where their case had been assessed, they've had the right of appeal, and they were considered not to be in need of international protection. And that, I think, is a price we at times have to pay to protect asylum space, to have an alternative migration track, but also to acknowledge that some people have to go back home against their will, and it's never going to look nice if they really protest. But it does not mean that it has to be inhuman.
Mm. Another example, just to follow up on that, is the example that we saw with it was mentioned already today, the unaccompanied minors that came from Honduras and Nicaragua and that traveled to the US, where the US also was very harsh and had a lot of criticism because they returned most of them back to Honduras and Nicaragua. But what they did, mostly in silence, but I know because we have been working with them on that track, is to open up a protection mechanism in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and say, okay, if you come to us here, not you travel on these unsafe routes and you travel via smugglers and then you travel all the way up through Mexico, where you're exposed to a lot of violence, abuse, you lose a lot of your money. You come to us here and you tell us your story. And you let us know, I mean, there are people who are trying to quit the gangs, and if they stay in Nicaragua or in Honduras, they fear for their life. And they have opened up protection channels to do that, for them to come to the US. And those are the ways. I agree with your point that you were making. If we want to have regular migration channels, if we want labor migration channels that work, if we want family reunification to work, if we want humanitarian visas to be put in place or temporary protection to be put in place, these need to then be adhered to. The rules need to be followed, because otherwise you get massive abuses of the system, and then we get a little bit back into the troubling scenarios. And yeah, I agree what you were saying. Just maybe also to the point that you were making on what High Representative Mogherini was saying. If I had understood correctly, she said no boots on the ground in Libya. So there she was quite clear on that. And I mean, if you'd ask me, I don't think that Europe will go at it alone. That's probably why she was looking for support in New York.
I just wanted to address also the comment on the safe harbor argument, whether the practice today is that safe harbors are only the ones on the European side, and that boats can never be returned to a North African port. I think this is why I presented it also in combination with a non-refoulement principle, meaning that if a boat is rescued, then brought back to a harbor in North Africa, the question would then be if that would be a state who we can imagine is in a state of being able to process and guarantee the rights of protection of these migrants, which we do not see is the case for Libya today. It could be the case for Tunisia, but much fewer migrants leave Tunisia now, which is probably also because it's more stable. They have more border guards preventing people from leaving from Tunisia as compared to earlier on in the Arab Spring. So the practice today, to a large extent, is that safe harbors are, because it's in combination with a non-refoulement principle, is to be being brought back to or being brought to Europe.
I just want to add on to that.
Yeah, and I wanted to also add how does it work in practice for you?
Yeah, because I think what's important, in some ways it's up to the captain. The captain is in charge of the ship and has sort of the final decision on the security of the ship. We also have to remember these people have paid thousands of dollars to go to Europe. You have 500 migrants on board on a vessel with a crew of 15, and they tell them, we're going to Tunisia, we're not going to Europe. They're not going to be very happy about that. So there is, so yes, I think in terms of a sort of security point of view, Tunisia is a closer, safe harbor than many other places. But the second you tell the refugees you're not going where they want to go, that can create an uprising and create a much more unsafe situation. I think also to the question about the military operation, per my understanding, the EU can do intelligence and can do arrest and destruction of ships in international waters without a UN mandate. And it seems that they do want to go ahead with that bit of it. But if they go into Libyan territorial waters, or then they need a UN mandate. So just the fault that, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
For what I just read, I think that this is the way they are trying.
They have a three-phase from what we've understood. They want to do intelligence, they want to do arrests in international waters, and then if they get a UN mandate, they want to go into Libyan waters.
I think that the Italian government should be very happy of this choice, but finally brought attention to Libya without having to expose itself.
But the Italian Coast Guard has been very critical of the military operation. I think that's one thing also, the ships, the merchant ships that we deal with. Everybody says that the Italians do a fantastic job. They're very professional. The MRCC in Rome is very good. They're the ones who really know what's going on out there, and I think it's important to listen to them.
And they have been invited a lot to the European Parliament to speak in the EU circles. I've seen them on a lot of presentations, and indeed they have been praised left and right. Yes,
but they have done a very, very good job.
Just maybe one comment on the.
I'm not used as an Italian to get so much pride. Actually, I do not feel to share it. I think that, but that's for me the interesting point, and we have not touched so much is the fact that you are mentioning the 50% of the defense budget, and I know it's a good French, but I was reading yesterday interviews with the Guardian, actually, who is following much more than Italian newspaper the situation. And then the Italian Coast Guard was actually very critical of the decision to go away with the military level and not using military ship from search and rescue mission as first, like as we were saying, search and rescue as a primary objective and not military objective. But that's a little bit this question. I have the feeling that the discourse has been on a completely different level, even a different level compared to border guards and border controls. I used to work a lot on security technology for border controls, and I feel I'm out of business here. I feel that this is the end of border control. This is the beginning of a new period of military intervention. Is no more securitization, or policing, is direct military intervention, and I feel it in the declaration of UK military, who is to help with military means and for military purpose. That's a kind of military stuff that they have put at disposal. I see it in the big cleavage within the Italian government between the more like the faction that is closer to the military option and smuggling as the new slavery, which is quite a discussable topic actually, and the Coast Guard. So what you can say about this shift, this spin to a different level? Today we have, on the one side, listened to the fact that is finally something that is horrible, like 3,000 people drawing is horrible, but is very, very small from a numerical point of view, and from a Russia point of view, it's not such a big issue. At the end of the day, it's a tragedy, but not an issue on the one side. On the other side, we are addressing a lot the issue from a completely new perspective, that is foreign policy and security policy. Actually, it's the first time that we are using security mission for addressing smuggling and criminal activities. Actually, not even counterterrorism. Mogherini stated yesterday that this idea that terrorists are infiltrating is not to find evidence even in EU intelligence gathering. So how can we assess this double move? On the one side, something very small and tragic. On the other side, we are bringing wars.
I'll make a few comments. Actually, I'm fortunately still in Europe. 3,000 dead people is a very high number. And it has caused a shift in focus. So it is not seen as an expendable number of people in a warlike situation, because we are not at war in the Mediterranean. It's the world's most dangerous border in a non-conflict area. But it is still an area of non-conflict. I think a lot of the security talk is because we haven't managed to come up with better options. It's sort of the lack of the other policies. And it's our frustration at the smugglers' networks that it is such a lucrative business. And the fact that we struggle with having given the smugglers a monopoly on transport from North Africa to Europe. And we haven't developed the other options. I hope that it'll not become an actual military operation against the boats, because I think from what we've seen of other military adventures recently in that part of the world, they tend to have an outcome that wasn't quite as expected when we started. So hopefully voices like the Italian Coast Guard, that is one of the few voices with actual experience now, in addition to the commercial ships, will be listened carefully to. But I also think it's important that others, particularly in the political arena, But also organizations like yours, like IOM, come up with options on how to deal with the so-called irregular migration and smuggling. That does not entail bombing it back to the beginning.
No, and maybe. Go ahead.
No. I think sort of in bit of a prolongation to this, I think we follow the contingency planning sector. We follow sort of security issues all around the world. We don't only work with Mediterranean issues. We also follow the Libya situation for a while. And there is the fear that these militias can take advantage of a situation where you would start bombing. You would create a sense of conflict that could have a spillover effect, which maybe hasn't really completely been thought through.
I know that there is Christine, but I'll give you first the floor to somebody else.
Thank you. Just to get back to the Vietnamese issue, I quite like the idea of this is a crisis of memory and a crisis of of morals rather than a crisis of migration. And I seem to remember that in the Vietnamese boat people case, the neighboring countries didn't at one point started refusing letting people land because of the numbers. And at that point, the countries who owned the ships, to put it that way, had to guarantee that they would receive these people, so that Norwegian ships would pick up people at sea and be allowed to put them in the Philippines or wherever it was, upon guarantee that these people would be allowed entry into Norway. So that's an idea. Another thing that I think Norwegian authorities did was to compensate the owners of the ships directly for the work that they did. And I haven't seen that suggestion coming up. I don't know why. I also think that they should do something to train the people on board, the staff of the ships, to meet these situations.
Thank you very much. I will take also Christine's question. And if there are no other questions after this round of replies, we'll close the panel.
Well, just first, a very small, brief comment. In April, the U.S. Air Force managed to have its Reaper destroy a boat for the first time in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can wonder why they were practicing destroying boats with armed drones last month. But it works now. And more European countries are scheduled to buy armed drones this spring. My question is, what about everybody else? Because the scenarios you line up now with all these programs, humanitarian admissions, asylum procedures, massive resettlement schemes, we still have Afghanistan. We still have DRC Congo. We still have, coup in Burundi. We still have huge refugee flows everywhere else in the world as well. They will also be mixed, but they at the moment get a lot less attention because we're, it's a little like Ebola, right? It's coming to us. And so while we are thinking about humanitarian solutions to this is a trade-off. If you're going to think a lot about giving humanitarian protection to a population that consists largely of economic migrants, you have less to offer someone else. And I would like to see people on the good side reflecting a little bit more on this. I know it's tricky, but it means you can offer less to someone else who has less voice in a moment.
Thank you very much. Please.
Okay, so I'm going to respond to sort of the flag. I think during the Vietnam crisis, a lot of what we call a Norwegian ship is a Norwegian flagged ship. But most of our ships are not Norwegian flagged anymore. It's Marshall Island, it's Liberia, it's Singapore, it's Malta. So if we start using the sort of flag state principle on this, then it's just not going to work. We had that Bourbon Orca, which the film was from. That was a Norwegian flagged vessel. They had a Norwegian crew. That was an exception. Most of them, it's Filipino crew, it's Indian crew. It's a very that's not a realistic. Plus, there's no we discussed this when this crisis began. There's no legal way to do that. When it came to training the staff, we made last fall some suggested guidelines based on the experiences from Norwegian vessels that we've sent across to all Norwegian ship owners. It's also been the basis of the International Chamber of Shipping's guidelines for these large-scale and we also discussed this training crews, but they don't have time. They're on ships. This is not their main task, is not to rescue people at sea. They will do it as a one-off if they're there, but we don't want to create sort of make this a systematic thing. That is important for us as well. This is not their main job. We want appropriate search and rescue resources, and we want people that are trained to do it to be in the areas where the migration flows are the largest, and let the commercial vessels also have an important role. Some of them are cargo ships. They're taking goods from one place to the next. They're being deviated. It's not the right people should do the right jobs in some ways. So that was my.
Yes, in regard to the last question, I have to say that I think it's a misunderstanding if it has come across the idea of giving humanitarian access to everybody. The idea, at least what I am instigating.
Programming. I mean,
Programming. If people are coming, they have to be treated in accordance with refugee law, in accordance with human rights law. And for those who are not in need of protection, have to be returned, but it has to be done in an appropriate way. That at least is what I'm trying to get across. And not,
schemes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, which is part of this. We need resettlement schemes, we need humanitarian visas. There's a number of things that need to be done in order to establish the legal avenues which are necessary at the moment. And it is not in order, to forget other crises or other countries or other nationals at all. But this is the focus we are having here in this seminar today, as I've understood it. So
also, it's not to forget that the EU is active on a lot of other platforms. In development cooperation, there is a lot of budget that goes towards development cooperation. We're working in a lot of countries of origin with development funding. And then it's directed to migration on a regional level. As you were explaining in Southern Africa, there is also migration, and it's on a regional level, and there are programs in place there as well. And then there is one approach which are now, instead of the regional protection programs, they've added this famous D to it, the regional development and protection programs. And actually we're now getting much more attention from the EU, as in IOM has come on board on the implementation of these programs and look at the angle of development and how can we build resilience so that migration, it can be used as an option. That was what I was saying. It's a choice, but there are also opportunities in countries. There needs to be work on stability, on institutional building, and of course the EU has a whole remit of programs. They have the European Democracy Fund, they have the European Development Fund. Those are actually large portfolios. And large funding sources as well, which then would help with some of the other countries and nationalities that you were describing. But for sure that the Afghans are still in the refugee protection schemes, and same for the Congolese, because last year at the annual tripartite conference on resettlement, the Congolese were put next to the Syrians on a very high priority level, and was decided that 50,000 refugees, Congolese refugees in the surrounding countries would be up for resettlement. So, I mean, it's a whole range of initiatives, I would say, that we have to look at.
Very quickly, refused to go to shore in Vietnam. Yes, that was part of the problem for a while. But it was also where compromises were made, in that either by the ship that picked them up, the nationality of that, such as Norway, or others offered resettlement places. I think there's a parallel to the Italian situation. They are taking them ashore, but they're looking the other way as they move on to avoid the Dublin complications. So it's a very pragmatic approach. But if you had some more responsibility sharing, things could be a bit more accommodating. On compensation to ships, it has been suggested, Shipping Association never talks about it diplomatically, but it has been suggested by the High Commissioner. I think what we see now in the Mediterranean is that if you have an extensive government search and rescue capacity that covers the entire area, the time that a ship gets delayed is minimized, and that takes much of the pressure of that discussion. Training on ships, we talked a little bit about it actually, on having tiny crash courses in refugee camp management on ships, but it is a bit complicated, and they are moving things, and they know much of this much better than us. On the others, just in between today, I've been in the parliament lobbying for an increased billion Norwegian kroners for Syria, precisely so that we don't take money from all the other operations, as we are facing new challenges here. So we want to, with the large crisis now, and the Syrian displacement crisis being the biggest growing of them all and contributing to the Mediterranean dilemma, we need actually to prioritize more money into humanitarian development migration schemes than we're doing at present.
Yeah, I will just pick up on the last point of Paul, which you also mentioned in your presentation about the small funding that is for the moment put into the current responses. As a response to the last question, what about all the others? It has been provocatively or bravely suggested by some in the last couple of weeks that what is needed now to respond to the current situation, both in terms of acute search and rescue needs, in terms of the needs to reinforce the reception infrastructure, but also in terms of those countries where people flee from, but also the other countries that you mentioned, that there's a need for a Marshall Plan to respond to this current situation. So I think that in any case, there's a need for more money to be put on the table to be able to respond to the different situations we are faced with.
Yeah, you actually had two programs with money on it. It was respectively 30 million and 20 million euros. That makes 10 cents per European. It's not extremely
Yes.
ambitious.
Yes, no, that is absolutely true.
Okay, thank you very much. We are already over our time. Thank you to all the speakers this afternoon, this morning, and I hope it was a very nice seminar for you too, and we brought the discussion on different fronts. Thank you again, Maria, for the organization.
Thank you.